Well, what's up, guys? Welcome to The Collision. Daniel here, and the Christmas movie season is fast approaching. There's just something about this time of year that's just sort of fertile soil for just uplifting and kind of inspirational stories. Well, I Heard the Bells is a new faith-based film that's just hitting theaters through Fathom Events in December. I've got a chance to see this movie early, so let's talk about it. Well, the holiday seasons bring a lot of traditions every year, and one of those traditions is that I get sick. So I apologize. I'm working through a bad cold. But I'm always game to talk about Christmas. I love Christmas, and I Heard the Bells is a Christmas movie, but maybe a Christmas movie of a bit of a different sort. This is a film that tells a true, kind of based on a true story of America's poet, the poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, one of the great poets in our nation's history, and kind of tells the story of how he his journey that led him to pen the great poem, which eventually became a holiday carol, Christmas Bells, and kind of how he did that against the backdrop of the Civil War and just sort of great personal tragedy. And if you guys know me at all, you know I'm a classic literature nerd, and I'm also a Christmas fanatic. So this is definitely a film that just sort of the subject matter of it definitely intrigued me. I have a bit of a complicated relationship with faith-based films. Sometimes you have to go into these movies kind of plugging your nose, hoping it doesn't stink too much. And I was just sort of hoping that, hey, my love of literature and poetry and Christmas would kind of overcome some of those problems. And I'm happy to say that I didn't need to plug my nose at all. This is a good film. This is. There is some kind of some of the shortcomings that you find kind of common throughout a lot of faith-based films, and we'll get into some of that. But kind of beyond that, and kind of transcending or rising above some of that, is that this is a really meaningful, kind of emotional story, and I think there's enough filmmaking competency to just do that story justice. So this is the first kind of theatrical movie from the production company Sight and Sound, which some of you guys might be familiar with. Kind of previously, they've done a lot of theatrical performances and putting on live theater, and this is sort of their first step into the world of cinema and film. And kind of that theatrical background is definitely evident at times. I think particularly with some of the acting. And that's not to say that the acting is poor. I think at times actually it's quite good. There's really no weak acting going on. It's just that a lot of it is kind of, especially near the beginning, it seems, is done kind of with that more theatrical flair rather than kind of what you're used to, I guess, with more sort of kind of cinema or kind of classic movies. But for the most part, this film I think represents a successful kind of first debut into film. The cinematography is well done. I think there's even a couple of moments where it has kind of shows off some sophistication, kind of some longer tracking shots and stuff, and that I enjoyed. Kind of like all faith-based films, obviously. Doesn't have the same budget that maybe a mainstream Hollywood movie would have, and you kind of see that if you kind of look closely. You can kind of see some of that. This story is sort of set against the backdrop of the Civil War, and you're kind of on location for some of these, for some of the war. But all the action, all the spectacle happens just off screen. You just can't see it. You sort of see the characters, and they're looking at it. Obviously things that they maybe would have done if they had a higher budget, but. On the other side of that, this thing never looks cheap. The set design and they definitely make the most of what they have. This definitely doesn't kind of fall into the church Christmas program kind of quality that maybe sometimes you get. This definitely looks and feels like a normal kind of Christmas film. But I think kind of the heart of this film, and I think the biggest strength of this film, is just the story itself. I Heard the Bells. It has a kind of a deep, meaningful story, and what I appreciate about this film is that it shares that story rather than preaches it. Like I said, sometimes like many people, I've had sort of a complicated relationship with some faith-based films, which just sort of often seem to me like they're sort of a sermon that's sort of poorly disguised as a movie, and it's really just a chance to sort of preach and push, and has a very message message driven. This movie doesn't overcook its message. It has an uplifting message. It has a story, but it kind of focuses the journey, or like the focus of this film more like the personal journey of Longfellow, the poet, and I think kind of to a lesser extent, kind of his family. So it's less that this is a like a sermon about grief and overcoming grief and finding hope, and it's more that this is kind of looking at a story of how one kind of broken man did that journey, and it just makes it feel way more authentic and less like you're being preached at, and at least for me, kind of way more captivating in that way. Because even during some of the scenes that maybe you could call like the more didactic or like evangelistic scenes, like there's a scene maybe kind of near the end of the film where a priest is kind of comforting Longfellow after some tragedy, and Longfellow's kind of questioning why, if there's a God out there, why could he let evil happen? And kind of the answer that the priest gives, kind of on its own, isn't necessarily like an intellectually satisfying answer. It's not like this is, you don't feel like you had some theologian writing the script just trying to give an answer to the audiences, but it doesn't need to be, because it feels more real in the moment. It feels like what a priest would say, kind of doing the best of his ability. And it's kind of more the focus on encouraging this man rather than kind of being this consumed, kind of turning the film into a Sunday school lesson. So at least for me, that is definitely one of the biggest strengths and kind of surprises for me with this film. As far as things kind of on the kind of content to be on the surface of this thing, I don't review very many faith-based films, so it's kind of refreshing that this is a short section. It's not as long as sometimes these sections are. Profanity, there's no profanity. Sexuality, there's no sexuality. Violence, there's not necessarily like gratuitous or like disturbing violence, but there are a couple kind of intense scenes. One in particular where like a woman's dress catches on fire, and ultimately the event kills this woman, and it's treated intentionally kind of like or alarming or disturbing or kind of shocking. The film, like the way they film it and kind of cuts, and it doesn't like zoom in. You don't see like the aftermath and all the burns or anything that would content-wise. But I do think it might be something that is an intense scene, especially for if there's you're bringing younger kids to see this. And there's also, this is setting against the backdrop of like the Civil War, and you don't see the much of like the actual like aftermath or like the carnage or the loss of life, but characters do talk about some of that, and just sort of like the death toll, and again, it's appropriately weighty when they talk about it, and you don't see it. But I guess as far as content, those are the only things that maybe to keep in mind. So as far as things kind of going like kind of beneath the surface of this, I think kind of the main theme that comes out in this film is sort of finding hope and finding God amidst a very kind of broken and hurtful world. The movie draws kind of its theme directly from the poem itself, which, hey, if you haven't read it before, Google it. It's a beautiful poem. And you kind of this movie kind of traces through almost each stanza of that poem, and kind of how, as in that poem, Longfellow's kind of wrestling with that question, which is essentially kind of the classical philosophical problem of evil, which just sort of says, hey, if there's a loving God that's all loving, all powerful, then why does he allow so much evil and brokenness and suffering in the world? That's kind of the theme of the poem, is trying to kind of find God and find love and hope when there's the Civil War going on, and Longfellow's intense kind of personal tragedies. And it's obviously a very difficult problem, and the film doesn't oversimplify it, but I think instead it kind of personalizes it. It sort of shows it through the perspective of how Longfellow deals with it. And there's kind of a scene, there's a quote where he's talking with the son who wants to enlist to fight in the war, and Longfellow doesn't want him to, where he says, hey, that's not God's will for you. And then his son responds, God's will. So you still believe in that. What do you think he was doing when the tragedy happened? Was he sleeping? Hope, I will not put it in a God who is sleeping or a God who is dead. There, I said it for both of us. Again, those words come directly from, or some of them come directly from the poem. But that's essentially kind of the main struggle for Longfellow. And again, the film doesn't minimize the suffering. I appreciate that while there is resolution to this, you sort of see how kind of God draws him back, and how he sort of changes his perspective. It doesn't go all the way. It's almost still a bittersweet kind of ending that, hey, there is suffering, but there still is beauty. There still is hope. And I think that's consistent with the poem, and I appreciate that the film kind of maintained some of that. And kind of maybe the other thing that comes out throughout this is just the power of art. You kind of see the kind of essentially like his wife, Longfellow's wife in the movie, how she kind of encourages him to keep writing, because she kind of says a couple times like, "Hey, poets can say what the rest of us are feeling." They're sort of the vocal point, and even like the bells that the Christmas bells that are sort of all throughout this kind of become a metaphor for him as a poet. That he is the bell, he is the one that can kind of proclaim the hope. Although this film it kind of is a more nuanced take on that, because you do see kind of in a later scene, Longfellow's son kind of confronts him, saying, "Hey, you write poems against slavery. You write these poems to try and inspire people, but then you won't let me go actually fight and do it." And you kind of do see the balance of, hey, we do need art, we need poetry, we need any kind of medium of art to inspire people, but that's not a substitute for action. That should just sort of lead us to action. So that's definitely kind of a theme that's also in there. So in the end, I really enjoyed this movie. Obviously, I'm somewhat of a target audience because I love Christmas movies and I love classic literature. But this isn't a cringeworthy film like maybe you might think if you've seen some other faith-based films. I will say, as far as like it's a Christmas movie, although it's not necessarily particularly like a festive one. And again, I think there's no problem with that. It doesn't. Not every Christmas movie needs to be some breezy holiday carol sing-along. I like that this is kind of set against the backdrop of Christmas, but it's dealing with kind of not more weighty themes. Maybe just adjust your expectations if you're expecting this to be a big jolly time with your family. It's not necessarily that film, although I do think it is a film that has a good story to say, and it's worth checking out. So I enjoyed this. I think if this is the first kind of sight and sound film, I think it's a promising start. I'm looking forward to seeing what they do next. But hey, let me know what you guys think about this. If you guys are curious, if you want to know more about the film before you decide if you're going to go see it when it hits theaters in December. Or if you do go see it, we'd love to have a conversation with that, what you thought of it, whether you think it handled the themes of grief and suffering. If you thought it handled it well, like I did, or if maybe you took some issues with it, let's talk about this film. Have a conversation, and I encourage you guys, if you haven't done so, subscribe to our channel. We've got a lot of stuff, movie reviews for smaller films, for big films. We've got live streams, we've got other videos and stuff. We'd love to have you be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thanks for watching. Stay safe and continue to collide with your world for Christ.